"I can dance, sir," said the maid's son. The millionaire laughed, but soon he was speechless. That night, before the world's elite gathered in a luxurious ballroom, an impossible challenge was laid down: to perform a choreography no one had ever dared attempt. Businessmen, artists, and politicians alike believed it would be just another spectacle of millionaire Howard Sterling's arrogance. But when a poor boy, the son of a maid, dared to raise his voice, the impossible happened. What began as a source of laughter turned into a historic scene no one will ever forget. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel now to help us bring you more moving stories that impact lives. Thank you. The main ballroom of the Sterling Grand Hotel in Manhattan gleamed like a temple of luxury. Crystal chandeliers reflected golden light onto impeccably set tables, where champagne glasses clinked amidst powerful conversations. It was the night of the grand annual gala hosted by Howard Sterling, a billionaire known as much for his fortune as for the arrogance with which he treated everyone around him. Renowned businessmen, influential politicians, and famous artists had accepted the invitation, certain that this evening would not be just another party, but a spectacle in which every detail would serve to exalt Howard's name. The ambience exuded wealth and vanity, but hid something even greater: an unexpected challenge that would change the course of that evening forever. The guests, dressed in impeccable formal attire, walked among white marble columns and exotic flower arrangements from Thailand. Practiced smiles and rehearsed greetings abounded, while photographers captured every moment for the covers of business and fashion magazines. In the center of the room, a vast dance floor was illuminated by silver spotlights, still empty, as if awaiting the start of a secret spectacle. Howard Sterling, in a tailored black suit and burgundy tie, loomed large, a man whose presence seemed to dictate the rhythm of the evening. He moved among the guests with the confidence of someone who knew everyone depended, in some way, on his approval. His haughty gaze, however, concealed a special intention: to announce a challenge that would put everyone to the test. Suddenly, a discreet signal caused the background music to cease. The murmur of conversations faded, and silence filled the room. Howard stepped onto a small stage, flanked by two security guards, and raised his champagne flute. His deep voice echoed through the room, charged with confidence and theatricality. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, smirking, "this evening will not only be a celebration, it will also be a trial. I have a challenge here that none of you will be able to fulfill, but I promise a reward so absurd it will be worth the attempt." A shiver ran through the guests. Some glanced at each other, others smiled curiously. What no one knew was that, in that same room, invisible to the eyes of the elite, a shy boy named Mateo Morales awaited a destiny that would change his life, and the billionaire's pride, forever. Howard Sterling placed his glass on the lectern and, with a calculated gesture, asked an attendant to bring an antique trunk onto the stage. The object, made of dark wood with gilded hardware, contrasted with the modern gleam of the hall and immediately caught the guest's attention. The billionaire slowly opened the trunk, revealing yellowed sheet music and a carefully stored parchment. "Here," he announced theatrically, "is recorded a choreography created almost 200 years ago by the Austrian master Franz Adler, considered by many to be the most difficult ever conceived. It is a riddle in dance form, something that not even the greatest dancers of our time dare attempt. Whoever can faithfully reproduce it in front of everyone will receive, and I'm not joking, $100 million. Nervous laughter spread, followed by a murmur of disbelief. Expressions varied between astonishment and amusement. Some laughed openly, considering it just another eccentricity of Howard, famous for his bizarre challenges and public humiliations. Others, more competitive, looked at each other with a glint of ambition in their eyes, even though they knew no one there had the slightest chance of executing something so complex. A renowned choreographer present at the event commented in a low voice. Not even with months of rehearsal would this be possible. The billionaire smiled with satisfaction as he saw the incredulity taking over the room. That was exactly the effect he wanted. For him, the challenge wasn't about dancing, but about power, about demonstrating that his wealth was so immense that he could transform any impossibility into a spectacle to entertain his audience of bored rich people. As eyes fixed on the stage, discreetly among the tables at the back, Lucia Morales, the hotel employee overseeing the service that night, stood firm with a tray in her hands. Beside her, almost hidden behind her, was Mateo Morales, her 13-year-old son, his attentive eyes never leaving the scroll held out by Howard. Unlike the others, who saw only an impossible challenge, Mateo felt his heart race. The choreography didn't seem strange to him. He recognized it from something his late grandfather had taught him on simple afternoons in the back of a small Bronx apartment. The boy clenched his fists silently, not daring to say anything, but an idea was beginning to germinate in his mind, an idea that would change not only that night, but his entire life. A growing buzz filled the hall after the announcement. Some women in long dresses fanned themselves in surprise, while men in expensive suits exchanged wry glances, as if the billionaire had just proposed an elaborate joke. A famous music producer, sitting in the front row, laughed out loud and said, "Howard, you really know how to entertain society. 100 million for an impossible move? Genius." Others agreed, but underneath there was a strange tension. What if someone actually tried? The challenge seemed impossible, but the amount offered was so absurd that, for a moment, even the most skeptical imagined the possibility of seeing a historic spectacle unfold right there. The hall, previously filled with side conversations, now vibrated with anticipation. Howard observed everything with the sadistic pleasure of someone manipulating the attention of hundreds of people at once. He scanned the crowd, as if hunting for a victim who dared to volunteer. The silence was almost absolute when he challenged. Nobody? Among all the artists, musicians, dancers, and businessmen present, isn't there even one willing to risk it? The challenge echoed like an arrow, piercing the pride of the guests. Some shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, others lowered their heads. The feeling was clear. No one wanted to be the target of Howard Sterling's public humiliation. At the back of the room, however, the atmosphere was different. Mateo Morales, just 13 years old, couldn't take his eyes off the displayed parchment. He recognized every line of that ancient choreography as if it were part of his own memory. He remembered the afternoons when his grandfather, a passionate classical dancer, would teach him complex movements while repeating, "True art is not made for applause, but for touching hearts." Beside him, his mother, Lucia Morales, felt her discomfort growing. She knew how much her son loved to dance, but she also knew Howard's cruel pride. If Mateo dared to open his mouth, he could become the target of ridicule from all that elite. Yet, there was something in the boy's eyes, a mixture of courage and conviction, that made her sense something great was about to happen. While eyes remained fixed on the stage, few noticed the discreet presence of Lucia Morales, walking briskly between the tables, balancing trays laden with sparkling glasses. Her simple uniform contrasted with the evening gowns and luxurious suits parading around the room. To the elite in attendance, Lucia was invisible, just another employee serving their whims. But beside her, hidden among the long tablecloths and golden columns, was Mateo Morales, her 13-year-old son. With every step his mother took, he followed silently, his eyes attentive, absorbing every detail of the event as if he were part of a forbidden spectacle in which he was not supposed to participate. Mateo wasn't like the other teenagers who frequented that hotel for charity parties or lavish birthdays. The son of a maid who endured grueling shifts to support them both, he had learned to be content with little and to transform simplicity into art. From a young age, he spent hours listening to the stories of his grandfather, who, despite his poverty, carried the passion of an artist. It was with him that Matteo discovered the secrets of forgotten movements, rare steps that blended refined technique with raw emotion. And now, seeing the scroll displayed by Howard Sterling before hundreds of guests, a flame ignited within the boy. This wasn't just an impossible choreography. It was a piece of his own story that no one there had imagined existed. Lucia, however, felt a lump tighten in her throat. She knew her son's gaze, that restless gleam that always appeared when the dance was at stake. Deep down, she feared Matteo would dare expose himself. Howard didn't just laugh at those who failed. He destroyed reputations with a single word, and doing so in front of the world's elite could scar the boy forever. Trying to protect him, she discreetly grabbed his arm and whispered, "Matteo, please don't do anything." But the boy remained motionless, staring at the stage with the silent determination of someone who knew he was facing a unique opportunity, the chance to turn humiliation into glory. Howard Sterling strode across the stage like a maestro of arrogance, feeding off the audience's submissive gazes. His eyes swept the room in search of a target, someone who would dare to be his plaything that night. Suddenly, his gaze lingered at the back of the room, where he spotted Lucia Morales with a tray in her hands. He recognized her as one of the hotel employees, someone of no consequence. Noticing a boy beside her, he gave a crooked, cruel smile. "Just look," he said loudly, drawing everyone's attention. "If even the maid's son had the courage to try, maybe we'd at least have a good laugh." Thunderous laughter echoed through the room, coming from guests eager to follow the host's wicked game. Lucia felt her face burn, as if every gaze was burning away her dignity. She gripped her son's arm tightly, trying to prevent him from becoming a target of Howard's cruelty. "Be quiet, please," she murmured, her heart racing. But the billionaire didn't back down. On the contrary, he seemed to savor every second of humiliation he inflicted. "What's wrong, kid?" he teased, leaning toward the boy with a mock curiosity. "Are you scared? Or did you just inherit your mother's talent for carrying trays?" The collective laughter erupted again, and the sound seemed deafening to Lucia, who was fighting back tears. Matteo, however, didn't look away. His brown eyes shone with a mixture of anger and courage. As the entire room laughed, he took a deep breath and stepped forward, freeing himself from his mother's hand. The silence that followed was almost instantaneous, as if no one had expected that reaction. The boy's voice, firm and clear, echoed through the room. "I can dance, sir." The confident, defiant tone immediately silenced the laughter. The champagne glass in a guest's hand slipped and shattered on the floor, breaking the spell of mockery. Howard's eyes widened for a moment before letting out a dry, incredulous laugh. "You?" he said, shaking his head. "A kid from the Bronx? The maid's son? I want to see that." For a moment, the entire room seemed to freeze. The sound of silverware, the clinking of glasses, and even the background music vanished as if plucked from thin air. All that remained was the echo of the unexpected phrase, "I can dance, sir." The guests looked at each other in disbelief, as if they hadn't heard correctly. An oil tycoon leaned over to his wife and murmured, "Did he really say that?" The maid's son. The woman simply shook her head, mouth agape, unable to respond. It was as if time had stopped, and everyone waited for confirmation that this was nothing more than a child's prank. Lucia felt her heart pounding in her chest. She tried to pull Matteo back, but the boy stood firm, staring directly at Howard Sterling as if nothing else mattered. His mother's eyes welled up, torn between pride and fear. She knew her son carried an extraordinary talent inherited from his grandfather, but she also knew the cruelty of that environment. Any failure would be transformed into public humiliation, and she couldn't bear to imagine Matteo crushed by the laughter of the elite. Yet the conviction in his eyes was so intense that Lucia, silently understood that she would be powerless to stop him. Howard, for his part, took a few seconds before reacting. First, he let out a loud, artificial laugh, which echoed through the room like a mocking thunderclap. "Did you hear that?" he said, raising his arms as if to share the joke with everyone. "The maid's son says he can dance the impossible choreography. What a wonderful evening. Besides champagne and caviar, we also have free comedy." The audience burst into laughter, but, curiously, not everyone laughed. Some watched the boy with genuine curiosity, intrigued by his courage. And, in the crowd, a different silence began to emerge, not one of disbelief, but of anticipation. The laughter echoed like a wave of contempt that seemed to crush little Matteo in the midst of the crowd. A banker with a thick mustache raised his glass and sneered. "Someone call a circus orchestra. The show's about to begin." A socialite in a silver dress waved a fan and remarked loudly, "How insolent, letting the maid's son tarnish such an elegant evening." Even some guest artists, who should have appreciated the talent, chose to laugh and shake their heads in disapproval, fearing they would become targets of Howard's cruelty if they showed support. The collective scorn was so intense that each laugh felt like an invisible blow delivered to the boy's courage. Lucia, motionless beside her son, fought back tears. She felt the weight of the words piercing the room like arrows, wounding her dignity as a mother. Her instinct screamed to protect Matteo, pull him back, hide behind the velvet curtains, and disappear. But something stronger held her back, the sparkle in the boy's eyes, which never dimmed even in the face of humiliation. She remembered her father teaching Matteo to dance in the cramped living room of their small apartment. "Never let them laugh at you, boy," he would say. "Art is greater than any laughter, greater than any applause." Now, seeing her grandson repeat those words silently seemed like a sign that her family's story was about to change. Howard Sterling, realizing he had the audience in his hands, decided to go even deeper with his cruelty. He walked to the edge of the stage and, pointing at Matteo, said mockingly, "Well, since you insist, dance, boy. Show the world how pretense can also be comical. But know this, if you fail, if you stumble, if you can't even begin, you will be remembered not as a dancer, but as the joke of this evening." The room erupted in more laughter, some clapping mockingly, others whistling as if they were at a cheap show. And, in the center of this storm of derision, Matteo stood firm, lifting his chin as if he carried within himself a truth no one there dared imagine. Lucia Morales's heart seemed caught in a whirlwind. As the room erupted in laughter, her mind wandered back to the simple, quiet days of her childhood in rural Mexico. She remembered her father, the same man who, decades later, would become Matteo's beloved grandfather, dancing with a passion that made the wooden floor creak with emotion. He had no fame, much less wealth. He danced to survive and, above all, to convey joy. "Dance is a language that only pure hearts understand," she would say, lifting her young daughter in her arms and spinning her around the cramped room. Lucia smiled with tears in her eyes, remembering that time when poverty and happiness coexisted without shame. When Matteo was born, it was this same grandfather who became his first teacher. At 3 years old, while other children were learning to play with building blocks, he was already repeating steps from old choreographies, blending innocence with innate talent. Afternoons in the small Bronx apartment were filled with improvised music. Pots and pans became drums. The old radio played out of tune notes, and in the center of the room, a curious-eyed boy learned to transform pain into movement. "Matteo," his grandfather would say, holding his hands, "one day you will understand that dance is not about applause, but about touching the soul of those watching. And when that moment comes, don't be afraid. Just dance." Lucia closed her eyes for a moment, trying to gather strength. The echo of those memories throbbed in her chest, colliding with the fear she felt now. The luxurious ballroom, The cruel laughter, Howard Sterling's look of contempt. It all seemed too overwhelming. But when she looked at her son again, she saw in him the same flame that had once shone in her grandfather's eyes. Mateo wasn't just a shy boy facing an arrogant billionaire. He was the bearer of an invisible legacy, of an art that had crossed generations to reach this point. And in that moment, Lucia understood that nothing could stop him. No matter how painful the journey, he was destined to make that night something no one would ever forget. Howard Sterling, sensing the silence was beginning to grow heavy, raised his hand like a conductor conducting an invisible orchestra. His eyes gleamed with mockery, and his voice echoed through the room with calculated theatricality. "Very well, since you insist so much, boy, dance. Show us if your audacity can produce anything other than laughter." The sarcastic tone immediately caused many guests to burst into laughter. Others clapped mockingly, as if they were about to witness a comedy show, not a real challenge. Howard, satisfied with the humiliating atmosphere, leaned back in a chair reserved for dignitaries, crossing his legs and raising his champagne glass, confident that he was in for a show of failure. Mateo took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the gazes piercing him like sharp blades. For a moment, his legs trembled, and the billionaire's cruel voice seemed to echo in his mind, trying to convince him he was doomed to ridicule. But then, as if a flame reignited within him, he remembered training with his grandfather, the steps repeated until exhaustion, the advice whispered like prayers. Never dance to prove anything to anyone. Dance because it's who you are. He remembered the words that had accompanied him since childhood. Fear began to give way to courage, and an unexpected serenity took hold of him. Lucia, still nearby, could barely breathe. She wanted to scream, to beg her son to give up, but she knew it was useless. Something greater was driving Mateo that night. Seeing the determination on the boy's face, she understood that fate does not back down in the face of fear. The entire room leaned forward, eager for the scene that was about to unfold. Howard, impatient, stamped his foot and said firmly, "Hurry up, boy. Dance now, before the world's elite, and prove you're nothing but a pretentious fool." The challenge had been thrown down. The stage for humiliation was set, but, unbeknownst to anyone, it was also the stage for redemption. Mateo stepped forward, his simple sneakers contrasting with the glare of the spotlight-lit marble floor. His heart was pounding so hard he could feel it echoing in his ears, but his expression remained firm. The room, filled with sarcastic smiles, waited for the moment the boy would stumble and confirm the collective joke. Some guests were already readying their cell phones, certain they would capture a ridiculous scene to laugh at later. Howard Sterling, leaning back in his chair, twirled his glass between his fingers with a half-smile, as if he could already foresee failure. But deep in Mateo's chest was something greater than fear. The memory of his grandfather, the silent promise not to allow art to be used as a source of mockery. He closed his eyes for a moment and slowly raised his arms, beginning the first movement of the choreography. Laughter rang out immediately, but soon merged with the delicate sound of the orchestra's violins, which, without any order, began to play a soft theme, almost instinctively. The musicians, intrigued by the boy's courage, decided to accompany him as if recognizing the gravity of the moment. Mateo's steps, initially timid, became firm, rhythmic, as if each gesture were guided by something invisible. His frail body seemed to gain another dimension, moving with a precision that contrasted with his simple appearance. The collective laughter began to fade, turning into uncertain murmurs. Lucia watched motionless, her hands trembling against her apron. Her son's every movement was a blow to the room's disbelief. She knew no one there expected greatness from a boy from the Bronx, especially the son of a maid. But with each gesture, the truth asserted itself. He wasn't just dancing, he was revealing a soul trained in purity and pain. the room slowly fell silent. Even Howard, still trying to maintain a mocking air, leaned forward slightly, intrigued. Something about this dance was breaking the logic of humiliation and transforming the impossible into a spectacle. It was only the beginning, but it was already clear that the boy wasn't a laughingstock. He was a source of amazement. Mateo, now in the center of the dance floor, seemed to have completely forgotten the crowd surrounding him. His movements flowed with a precision almost impossible for someone his age. Every gesture was charged with emotion. Every step seemed to tell an invisible story, as if the dance were a bridge between the past and the present. The hall, previously filled with laughter and sarcasm, fell into a reverent silence, broken only by the sound of the strings, the orchestra playing in perfect harmony. The astonished guests leaned forward in their chairs, unable to take their eyes off the boy who was making the impossible a reality before them. As he progressed through the choreography, Mateo blended the impeccable technique of his ancient steps with the spontaneity of his own creativity. It was as if his grandfather's essence was alive in his movements, but enhanced by something unique, something only he could offer. A precise turn made the audience hold their breath, followed by a swift leap that drew gasps of astonishment. The same people who had been laughing at him minutes before were now wide-eyed, some with their hands over their mouths, unable to believe what they were seeing. Even art critics present, accustomed to watching the world's greatest dancers, murmured in shock, "It's impossible, but he's doing it." At the back of the room, Lucia felt her heart burst with emotion. Tears finally flowed, no longer from fear, but from pride. She saw in her son not just the shy boy who helped with the housework, but the artist he was destined to be. Mateo's every move was a silent response to humiliation, proof that talent and dignity know no social class. Howard Sterling, sitting in the armchair, no longer smiled. His hardened expression revealed the internal struggle between the mockery he wanted to maintain and the undeniable recognition of the greatness before his eyes. The tables had turned. The joke he planned was turning into a spectacle that robbed even his authority. When Mateo executed the final sequence of the lost choreography, a perfect spin followed by a nearly impossible balancing act, the entire hall seemed to hold its breath simultaneously. For a moment, the silence was absolute, heavy, as if even the air had frozen. The guests, who had previously been laughing, now looked at each other in shock, unable to find words to describe what they were seeing. A renowned critic from Vienna, a special guest for the evening, whispered, "That's exactly it. It's Adler's choreography. I never thought I'd see anyone perform it." These words, though whispered, echoed like thunder, for they confirmed the impossible. The maid's son had accomplished what no professional had dared attempt. The initial shock quickly turned to excited murmurs. Some guests rose from their chairs, approaching the dance floor as if to make sure they weren't dreaming. A socialite, who had been mocking moments before, brought her hand to her face to hide the tears that were beginning to flow. The orchestra musicians, moved by the intensity of the moment, increased the cadence, creating a grand, almost celestial atmosphere. The energy that hung over the hall was no longer one of mockery or superiority, but of reverence. Those who had considered themselves superior were now on their knees, in spirit, before the pure talent of a boy invisible until just a few minutes ago. In the audience, some began to applaud timidly, as if still afraid to break the spell. But soon the applause multiplied, growing like an overwhelming wave that swept across the hall from one end to the other. The sound was so intense it made the marble walls vibrate. Mateo's name began to be whispered, repeated, and then shouted by some, until it turned into a spontaneous chorus. It was an unexpected consecration. From a target of ridicule, the maid's son was now celebrated as a prodigy before the world's elite. Howard Sterling, however, remained seated, motionless, his face contorted in disbelief and silent rage. Howard Sterling remained seated in his velvet armchair, but he was no longer the same man who had begun the evening with arrogance and laughter. His hand, once steady as it held the champagne flute, now trembled slightly, and drops of the golden liquid splashed onto the Persian carpet without his noticing. The mocking smile, a hallmark of his arrogance, had disappeared, replaced by a rigid, almost petrified expression. His eyes, fixed on Matteo, reflected something rarely seen in Howard: incredulity. Accustomed to dictating the rules, humiliating opponents, and manipulating situations to his advantage, now found himself helpless before a boy who shouldn't have a voice, but who stole all the attention with the power of his art. The glass slipped from his fingers and fell to the floor, shattering with a sharp crash that echoed louder than the applause at that moment. Some guests looked back in surprise, but soon returned their gaze to the stage of the real scene. No longer Howard, but the boy who had defied their logic of power. The billionaire ran a hand over his sweaty forehead, trying to regain his composure, but each attempt failed. It was as if he stood naked before the audience, exposed, fragile, unable to maintain the mask he had worn for so many years. For the first time in a long time, he had no sharp retort on the tip of his tongue, no irony to silence the collective admiration. Within him, a whirlwind of conflicting emotions swirled. Wounded pride, anger, shame, but also a remnant of something he didn't want to admit: respect. Howard felt like a dethroned king before his own people. The elite who had once applauded him now cheered for another, an anonymous boy who had emerged from the shadows to steal his night of glory. He took a deep breath, but the air felt heavy, as if he were swallowing his own defeat. His watery eyes, fighting back tears, were proof that, even surrounded by wealth and power, Howard Sterling had never experienced true greatness, until that moment, when a maid's son forced him to swallow his silence. As Matteo's final movement came to an end, he stood motionless in the center of the dance floor, his chest heaving with the intensity of the dance. For a few seconds, silence reigned, as if everyone was still processing what they had just witnessed. Then, almost timidly, a lone burst of applause broke the silence, coming from an elderly woman, an art collector, who saw more than technique in the performance. She saw truth. The solitary gesture was followed by another, then another, until a wave of applause filled the entire hall. Within seconds, the deafening sound of applause echoed off the marble walls, mixed with shouts and exclamations of admiration. Some guests rose from their seats, giving a standing ovation. Others chanted Matteo's name as if they were in an arena. Tears streamed down the faces of people who would never publicly admit to having been touched by something so genuine. Photographers, previously interested only in capturing the presence of celebrities, now competed for angles to capture the boy's face. Even renowned critics, accustomed to cold judgment, nodded in reverence, acknowledging that they had witnessed something historic. It was as if the entire assembled elite had been forced to shed their masks of pride to admit the superiority of a boy no one had dared to take seriously. At the back of the room, Lucia could no longer hold back her tears. With trembling hands, she clutched her wrinkled apron to her chest, feeling that all the sacrifice of years of invisible labor had turned into victory that night. Her son was no longer just the maid's son. He was now a name etched in the memory of those who, until minutes ago, had despised him. This public, spontaneous, and overwhelming recognition not only elevated Matteo, but also redeemed the dignity of his mother and his family's legacy. The entire room, once a scene of humiliation, bowed in reverence. And at the center of it all, the boy stood firm, with discreet tears in his eyes, unaware that he had just changed the course of his own life forever. Howard Sterling remained seated, motionless, as the entire room erupted in applause. His hardened face revealed the internal conflict between wounded pride and the inability to deny what he had just witnessed. With each clap that echoed, it was as if his authority was crushed, and he felt diminished before the talent of a boy he had, seconds before, tried to turn into a mockery. His mind raced for a way out, a joke, an irony, anything that would restore his control, but nothing came. Only the emptiness of someone who finds himself defeated not by another billionaire, nor by a business rival, but by someone he deemed irrelevant. Slowly rising, Howard walked to the center of the room. The applause faded as everyone awaited his reaction. With every step, the billionaire felt the weight of hundreds of eyes fixed on him, waiting to see if he would dare deny the undeniable. When he finally stopped before Matteo, the silence became absolute. He looked the boy up and down, as if still searching for some flaw, something that would justify his initial disdain. But what he found was only firmness and dignity in the boy's eyes. For a moment, Howard looked away, feeling a pang of shame, an emotion he hadn't experienced in a long time. His voice cracking, struggling with his own ego, Howard finally spoke. I've never seen anything like it. What you did here today can't be bought, can't be rehearsed, can't be invented. You've proven that greatness can come from where you least expect it. The audience reacted with astonishment, for it was rare, almost impossible, to see that man admit something like that in public. The billionaire took a deep breath, trying to compose himself, but it was too late. The transformation was complete. Howard, the man accustomed to laughing at others, had been forced to acknowledge the greatness of the maid's son. And in that moment, everyone knew they were about to witness a historic night. As soon as Howard's words echoed through the hall, the audience applauded again, this time with redoubled intensity. But for Matteo, that sound no longer mattered as much. His eyes searched only for his mother, who remained motionless in the back, her hands trembling on her chest and tears streaming down her face. Without a second thought, the boy ran across the dance floor to her. Lucia let the tray slip from her hands and fell to her knees, hugging her son tightly, as if she would never let him go. The entire hall fell silent at the sight. It wasn't just mother and son embracing. It was the victory of humility over arrogance, of dignity over contempt. Many guests, previously too proud to be moved, discreetly wiped away tears. Some recorded the scene on their cell phones, not to mock, but to preserve the memory of something they knew was unique. Matteo, with his head resting on his mother's shoulder, felt that nothing else mattered. Not the promised prize, not the glances of the elite, not even Howard's words. What truly mattered was his grandfather's legacy, which at that moment seemed alive within him, and the certainty that he had honored not only his family, but all those who had always been invisible to the powerful. He hadn't won out of vanity. He had won because he had the courage to be who he truly was. Howard Sterling, still shaken, remained silent, unable to regain control of the night. For the first time in years, he wasn't the star of his own party. The star was the boy who dared to say, "I can dance, sir," and, against all odds, left an entire room speechless. The promise of 100 million no longer seemed relevant. What remained was the truth no one could erase. Greatness can be born in the most unlikely places. When the applause returned, now louder than ever, Lucia raised her eyes to the sky, silently thanking him. Matteo, still in her arms, smiled. And so, the night that began with humiliation ended as an eternal triumph, etched in the memory of all who witnessed the impossible happen. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel now, activate the bell, and share. This way, you'll help us bring you more moving stories that impact and transform lives. Thank you so much for your support.